Hello, it's your friend Phil, project management trainer and coach. We got a question in from our friend Jeff, who is studying for the PMP exam, and his question relates to the scope baseline versus the scope statement. The big question is, when is the scope baseline used as an input versus the scope statement, and why? Well, let's take a look. Let's use the Praizion Media ITTO tool to first of all filter the inputs here and look for all the inputs that have the word scope. So if we do that, we see that we've got the scope statement, the scope baseline, and the scope management plan. Let's deselect the scope management plan and go with these two. And this shows you, if you look very carefully, that we have the scope statement as an input to create WBS, the scope baseline as an input to define activities, the scope statement as an input to sequence activities, estimate activity durations, and develop schedule, and then the scope baseline as an input to estimate costs, determine budget, identify risks, and perform qualitative risk analysis. So the big question is, why not the scope statement for all of them? Or why not the scope baseline for all of them? Let's try and make sense out of this. So if you take a look at the first item here, create WBS, at this point you do not have the scope baseline anyway. So you're putting together a work breakdown structure and a work breakdown structure dictionary based on this input, the scope statement. All three of those add up to give you a scope baseline as an output. But the input is the scope statement. Moving on to define activities, which happens after create WBS. When you are defining activities, you need the lowest level of the WBS, the work package level, to break that down into activities. And for that reason, we need our WBS and our WBS dictionary, and those are baked into the scope baseline. Now, when it comes to sequencing the activities, putting them in order, you don't need your WBS. You don't need your WBS dictionary per se, because now you have your activities already. So in sequencing the activities, you need to be aware of the constraints and assumptions. You need to be aware of what one activity is dependent on, and so on. And that's why the scope statement is really all you need for that. The same thing with estimating activity durations. You already have your activities extracted from your WBS work packages, so all you need is your scope statement to give you an idea of constraints and assumptions, which will further clarify the duration. Developing the schedule, again, you already have your activities, so what you need is clarification on constraints, assumptions, and what is in the project, what is not in the project, and that will help you put together a good schedule. So you can see the scope statement is used in those. Now going to estimate costs, we know what estimating cost is all about. We are estimating the cost for activities or WBS components like work packages, like higher level components, maybe even at the control account level. For that reason, you need your scope baseline, which has the WBS. So all of those work packages, all of those control accounts, any planning packages, however you are estimating, having a work breakdown structure could help that process. Go into determine budget, the same thing. Remember, when you are determining the budget, you are not always working with a bottom-up estimate, or should I say, you're not always going down to the task level and rolling up. Sometimes your budget is determined at a much higher level. So you determine your budget at the highest level, and then you work down. And that's more like a top-down approach. Although we don't talk about estimating when we are determining budget, but I would like you to think about what typically happens in determining a budget in a firm. They throw out a number and you work the number in. So while we're not estimating, the mental approach is to have the budget at the top, at the root node, and work those numbers down into the control account, into whichever planning packages, and ultimately getting down to the lowest level, which is the work package. Again, this is not estimating, this is budgeting. But in many instances, to come up with a solid budget, to validate your budget, to vet your budget, you would need to see your WBS and your WBS dictionary and take all those constraints and assumptions into account to make sure your budget is as tight as can be. And that's why the scope baseline is an input to determine budget. For identifying risks, think about it. To identify risks, you could think about a checklist, but you could also think about identifying your risks based on your work breakdown structure. So as you look at the different elements within one of the stems of your WBS, that could help you gain further clarity as far as, hey, which risks in this stem could affect the project? Or what are the risks from this stem that could affect the project? Or from under one control account, what are the troublesome areas that could pose to be risks in this control account, and so on. So you can identify risks using your WBS, looking at the components, looking at the stems, looking at the work packages, asking questions, and thinking in that line. And lastly, perform qualitative risk analysis. Remember, this is where we score our risks. So in order to do a good qualitative risk analysis and score the risks the most sensible way and the best way possible, you should have your scope baseline. You should have your scope baseline to really understand the risk in discussion. So you identify a risk and you're trying to score the probability and trying to score the impact. To do the best job, you need to know your project. You need to know the risk and which node or which element in your WBS that risk is linked to. And knowing that and understanding the work at the right level in the WBS could help you better score the risk. Maybe on a scale of 1 to 5, you're about to score 1, but someone comes up with finer understanding of that particular work package or component, and they tell you, hey, no, that's a 3, and this is why. Take a look at the WBS, take a look at all the adjoining elements, and take a look at how this could cascade into other things. That's why you need the scope baseline when you are performing qualitative risk analysis, to better understand what you're scoring and to give it an accurate score. So you wouldn't be able to pull that off if you didn't have the WBS and the WBS dictionary. Bear in mind, where you see the scope baseline, that's not to say that the scope statement could not be relevant. Remember, this is highly situational and it depends on the project. So in cases where you see the scope baseline, that's not to say that the project scope statement in the scope baseline is not a relevant input. It's not saying that, oh, all we need is the WBS and the WBS dictionary. No, no, no. Where you have the scope baseline, take it with a pinch of salt. Just take it that it really truly means everything in the scope baseline: WBS, the WBS dictionary, and the project scope statement. Okay, so I hope that helps demystify when the scope baseline is an input and where the WBS dictionary and project scope statement are inputs. Did I even get that right? Where the scope baseline is an input versus where the project scope statement is an input. Okay, when you see the scope statement on its own, which is predominantly, if you take a look at where you see this, where do you see this? I've made them bold one more time. The scope statement is an input to processes where the WBS is either not available, such as in Create WBS, or where you have already used the WBS and the WBS dictionary for purposes of understanding the activities that are playing on the project. Okay, well, I hope that helped. Remember, sending your questions to info@praizion.com. Thank you.